Hello, and welcome to our workshop. This workshop was previously delivered by SMU's Academic Learning Services Writing Center. As a result, you may hear references to other workshops, be prompted to take part in group activities, or hear references to the active chat from the original delivery of this session. As you follow along, feel free to pause the video and participate in exercises and activities as best you can. We hope you enjoy the workshop.
So, welcome back. Welcome back to the Writing Issues and Final Draft session. I had a really good time in the last one. I hope you did too. It's kind of a fun conversation at the end there. And we're going to take this a step further in this session. So we're going to start by looking at some common grammar issues and talk a bit about grammar just in general. And then we're going to look at applying all of this to revising and particularly peer revision, because we won't be looking at our own work. We'll be looking at an example of a piece of student writing. So to start off, grammar, while students often focus on grammar issues in their writing, it's something that people really want to work on, and they come to the Writing Center with the desire to improve their grammar often. As mentioned in the previous session, it should be the last item addressed when revising and editing your paper. It also is, while grammar is important, it's also not the focus of your grades. Most of your assignments, you'll receive a rubric, and so you'll see the breakdown of where your grades come from. And often, like I would say a maximum of 10%, maybe 20% of your overall mark on that assignment will be related to grammar. Most of it is about your ideas, the structure of your ideas, and showing that you're thinking and that you're learning and understanding what the your professor is trying to teach you. So grammar is an aspect of it. You might even find some rubrics where grammar doesn't count for marks, and instead your professor will just give you tips on grammar on how to improve it. And so keep in mind what you focus on in revising and writing your paper in general. Also look at the rubric of the assignment that you've been given, because that will help guide you on where you should put most of your energy and effort. First I have break down the anatomy of a clause. A clause is a group of words that contains a subject, and a subject is whom or what the sentence is about. So an example is like Denise, Paris, so we can have proper nouns, they, we can have pronouns. A subject is always some kind of noun in general, but there are other types of subjects. And it also contains a predicate. So it's what the subject does. So it could be jumped, went to the store, is my favorite activity. And a predicate always contains a verb and something else, not necessarily something else. It could just be Denise jumped, and that's her subject and predicate, and that's an independent clause right there. We'll get a little bit more into the definition between independent and dependent, but a predicate contains other information as well. There are two types of clauses that I just alluded to. There's an independent clause and there's a dependent clause. And I'm just going through this to give a bit of a background of sentence structure so that we can talk about grammar with a little bit of this background knowledge already having been discussed. An independent clause contains a complete thought and stands on its own as a complete sentence. So we have these very simple examples. The sun came up, my dog ate my homework, we waited for the bus, I studied very hard. In all of these examples, we have a subject, we have a verb, and we have some other information, and combined they make up a complete sentence. And I have this picture of a big, not kangaroo, it's actually a wallaby, who's independent on its own, compared to a dependent Joey here, who is not independent yet. And a dependent clause must be linked to an independent clause for its full meaning. And the signs of an independent clause, if we look at these examples here, we have these transition words. So because my dog ate my homework, since the sun came up, while we waited for the bus, although I studied very hard. In all of these, just reading them out loud, we kind of get the sense that something is missing. Because my dog ate my homework, what? Like maybe that's an answer to a question, but the overall sentence is, I can't turn in my paper because my dog ate my homework. Or since the sun came up, maybe I've been tired since the sun came up. You know, something, there's clearly a missing idea, and we can get that because of these transition words. And these clauses here are not complete sentences. And so we would need, if we saw them in a paper, we'd need to do some work to link them to other ideas or to complete them to make full sentences be grammatically correct. And so there are ways to connect clauses, to connect independent and dependent clauses to ensure that we're speaking in complete sentences. The first, most basic one is a period. So we're going to work with this example throughout a few different ways to connect clauses. The Haitian Revolution achieved independence and emancipation. Perfect, that's a complete sentence. It was an important event in the history of slavery. Again, a complete sentence. This is perfectly fine as is grammatically, but we're missing some transition words here. It might not be the best way to present these ideas. We could do a coordinating conjunction. So here we have the Haitian Revolution achieved independence and emancipation, and it was an important event in the history of slavery. This might be a little bit better, but aside from better or worse, it's really subjective. But basically what we're seeing here is that we can use this and as a coordinating conjunction between the two statements, between the two clauses, to connect them. We could use a subordinating conjunction where we have the word at the beginning of the sentence. And here in this example, we're getting a little bit more into how these ideas are linked. So they're not just two separate ideas. Now we have a connection word that implies causation. Because the Haitian Revolution achieved independence and emancipation, it was an important event in the history of slavery. Okay, so if this is the message that you wanted to communicate, I, as a reader, get this much better, right? With the first two examples, if you wanted to connect them as the fact that it was an important event because of what it achieved, I wouldn't know that, right? I wouldn't know that directly. Maybe I would infer that, but I wouldn't want to, generally as writers, as mentioned before, we want to make that clear to the reader and not make the reader have to guess at what our actual meaning is. Another option is a semicolon. The Haitian Revolution achieved independence and emancipation. It was an important event in the history of slavery. A semicolon replaces a period, so we can see these sentences are identical between the top and the bottom, except that we have a semicolon instead of a period. And what it does by doing that is it shows that these ideas are very closely linked. We'll talk a little bit about semicolons a little later on in this presentation. And the last idea that we have presented here to connect clauses is an appositive. So an appositive includes some additional information within the sentence, and we surround that by commas. The Haitian Revolution, an important event in the history of slavery, achieved independence and emancipation. This is also quite nice. Using appositives is a really great way to provide alternative sentence structure and to kind of create a flow within your writing. And it also communicates much like the subordinating conjunction. It communicates a little bit more information. So we're communicating that the Haitian Revolution is an important event, and through being an important event, it achieved independence and emancipation. So we get a little bit more information about that there as well. Any questions about these ways to connect clauses? Feel free to write in the chat if anything comes up. All clear? Okay. So common issues within sentence formation and clause connection are run-on sentences. A run-on sentence contains two independent clauses with no separation or connection between them. An example here, I couldn't sleep, my dog was barking all night. The Haitian Revolution achieved independence and emancipation. It was an important event in the history of slavery. It's a bit clear with the second one there because that's a very long phrase, and so we can kind of see that it should be broken up. For the first one though, this happens all the time where we have simple sentences. There are actually multiple sentences really. I couldn't sleep, that's one sentence. We have a subject and a predicate. My dog was barking all night. Also, we have our subject and our predicate. They're both independent clauses, and so they shouldn't be combined here. It's a run-on sentence. And we could divide them up with any of the ways that we spoke about just before. We could use a period, say I couldn't sleep, my dog was barking all night. We could use a semicolon. We might want to include a transitional device here. I couldn't sleep because my dog was barking all night. Something like that. There's lots of ways to fix things and to improve sentence structure when we see errors like this, and it really depends on style and preference. Another common issue is a comma splice. So this occurs when two independent clauses are separated by a comma alone. So much like a run-on sentence, we have two separate sentences, but instead of being separate, they're connected with a comma. And this is also very common. So an example, I'm tired, let's go home. Some days I walk to school, on other days I take the bus. Now again, these sound with the comma in there, they flow a little bit better, which is why they're very common errors. But as before, I'm tired and let's go home are both independent clauses, so they should be separate sentences. In the first one, maybe a semicolon would be best there. I'm tired, let's go home. But again, there are multiple ways that these can be fixed, these kind of errors. And it does take time to kind of identify these common issues within writing, but revising and peer revision will really help to identify these. I'm just going to do a note about grammar. We could go on about grammar for a really long time. We could talk about all kinds of stuff, but I don't want the focus of this presentation to be grammar. Grammar can be thought of as the tools we use to convey a rhythm of language. So part of the reason, as I mentioned before, when we read out those comma-spliced sentences, the rhythm was implied with the comma, and so it was harder to identify the error there. But basically what we're using, or what we're talking about when we talk about grammar, because I find, the topic of grammar is a little bit boring, to be honest. Like, it's not always clear. Sometimes it's difficult to understand what to do where, but it's really about rhythm. It's about how we speak and how we communicate with each other. So learning how to apply grammar to communicate your voice and your writing style is a personal journey. And that's why I'm not putting too much emphasis and not spending too much time on it today, because I could go on about all different kinds of grammar rules, but each of you have a different background. Each of you have different levels of comfort with grammar. And where you have the most room for improvement will vary by individuals. So to test where your strengths and weaknesses in grammar lie, check out the Writing Center Grammar and Style Guide. This is available online in the Writing Center website. It's also available in Brightspace underneath this Writing Center, or sorry, underneath this Writing Issues and Revisions subsection on the content. So this is a really large document that discusses various rules of grammar. It includes exercises and it has answers at the back of the book. So you can test them out if there's something you feel particularly uncomfortable with, and then you can see where you have the most space for improvement. I'm just going to include a quick poll just because I'm curious about what you're comfortable with, about your comfort with grammar. So I'm asking, how confident are you in your knowledge and use of English grammar? And it ranges from I feel confident, I feel okay, I feel unsure, I'm not confident, or I'm unsure. Okay, I'm going to end, and I'll actually just share these results so you can see we have a bit of a range here. We kind of have a sliding scale. So we have some comfort, some okay, a little bit unsure, and that's totally fine. So if you are more on the side of just feeling okay or not feeling super sure, then checking out this style guide and this approach, the style guide can be really helpful to figure out where you have the most room for improvement and what you should really be looking for in your own writing. Okay, so we're going to move on from that little grammar intro, a little blurb, to revising and giving feedback. So let's put all of this information that we learned in the session before lunch, as well as just now about our approach to grammar, and let's put this all to the test. Remember the order of operations. We start looking at structure. We have an opening, a body, a conclusion. We're looking at how the paper actually forms as a whole. Then we're looking at clarity to make sure that the ideas within that structure are clear, that they relate to each other clearly, and that we can see how they flow with each other. Thanks for that link, Mia. And then we get to the level of details where we're looking for grammar and sentence level issues. Whenever you're revising, whether it's your own work or other work, trust your reactions. They happen for a reason, and you don't have to be a writing expert to have insight and to provide feedback. You don't need to necessarily be incredibly specific, although it's okay if you are. But if you have a gut feeling that says, this doesn't sound quite right, or I'm not quite sure what this means, you're probably not the only reader who would think that. So it's probably worth noting. Justify your impressions. So whatever that first reaction is, provide some insight into why. If something isn't working, explain why. Do you have a recommendation, and how will it help? So always, rather than just correcting, because that's editing, we want to provide an idea of why you're providing the recommendation in the first place. Do you see an alternative interpretations of a passage? Is it possible that the meaning that the writer is conveying might not be the only way that it could be understood? If so, explain why you feel that way, and maybe offer a way that it could be improved. And if you point out problems, try to pair them with possible solutions. Again, we talked about this a little bit in the last section, where we don't necessarily want to write or correct for somebody. We don't want to overtake their style. That's an interesting line to walk. But pairing possible solutions can just help give people an idea of where that misunderstanding is coming from. And vice versa, if you get some feedback in your own paper and you don't really like the alternatives, take it with a grain of salt and revise as you see fit. Notice what works. So we're talking right now a lot about offering corrections, offering improvements, identifying misunderstandings, but in the writing process, it's also important to notice what's good. Maybe your topic sentences are really strong. Maybe your connection between ideas are great. And noticing these things is also really helpful as you move forward in the writing process. Okay. So there's 8 of us here at the moment. So I'm going to break you out into groups, but just before that, I have a writing example document to take a look at and provide feedback on. So I'm going to throw this into the chat. Okay, there we go. So it's a student sample. This isn't their whole paper. I've just taken one paragraph from the body of their paper. So it's a body paragraph. It's just the one that we're going to look at. And I'd like you to download that file. I will also, I can share it on my screen right now, just in case. So this is what it looks like here. We just have an example body paragraph. I'd like you to read through it on your own. I'll actually read it out loud. And then take a couple minutes just to make some notes. I'm going to, once I've read it out loud, I'm going to put you into some breakout groups. But what I'd like you to do is go through and either make some notes on a separate piece of paper of how you might provide your peer with some feedback here, what you might say, what you might identify as places for improvement. And then we're going to go into groups and chat about it. And then in your groups, I'd like you to select one person to be a reporter, someone who's willing to, when we get back into the main group, to discuss and share some of the revision and feedback that your group decided on. So this paragraph says, when international students travel abroad, at first sight, everything seems to be perfect, but quickly reality catches up to them. The language barrier is certainly the first challenge international students face as soon as they arrive in the country. They may feel like they have the language skills of a local 5-year-old. That barrier can cause trouble for simple things as taking the bus or buying something, because without language, there is no communication. However, there are many different ways to resolve the problem of language. At first, talking to native people is always a good way to understand a language, and also international students have to remember that to solve a problem, they can adapt a solution that works sustainably. One way to adapt quickly is changing how they are learning. For example, if learning at school does not improve their language skills, learning by watching movies, listening to songs with subtitles can be a good alternative. They just have to find a way to turn things that may be boring into things they like doing. And finally, students have to remember that having language problem is normal and that it is a passing situation. And then we have the source that they've cited down at the bottom there. Okay, so there's your paragraph. I'm going to stop sharing and put you in some breakout rooms. All right, I hope that you had enough time there to chat a little bit, at least get started on the revision. It's okay if there were a few more things that you maybe wanted to point out that didn't quite get to. Could I have someone from group 1 share some of your feedback on what kind of advice, what kind of feedback you would give to this student?
Okay, hi. We found, okay, wait, I've got to pull up my document again. Right. So overall, the structure was there. There was an opening. There wasn't really much space, I guess, for the hourglass shape or overall flow. They could have put an hourglass shape because there were so many ideas there, but they did not. Yeah. And there was body. There was a conclusion, but again, it's just a sentence structure that they could have changed. Mm-hmm. There wasn't really a flow of ideas. They started giving solutions before they would present the problem there. There we go. Yeah, they were running statements. Yeah, and there was also problems with their grammar in the details and in sentence levels, in the sentence structure, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, you mentioned there were some run-on sentences. Anything else that you noticed in particular that you would have offered advice on?
Not to use too many commas, because they've used a lot of commas everywhere, and to break up the paragraph into 2 or 3 sections. Outlining the introduction, then maybe the problem, the solution, and a conclusion.
Yeah, for sure. That could definitely be done. Could be an improvement for sure for clarity. Awesome. Okay, Mia, could I ask you if there's anything else that your group discussed that you wanted to add on to that?
Yeah, for sure.
Thanks.
We didn't get too deep into it, but one thing that I personally noticed is there were areas where transitional devices definitely would have benefited the writing. So, for instance, where the quote is introduced, my group was talking kind of about how it is important to kind of introduce a quote by connecting it to your own wording so that you're not just starting a sentence with a quote. So everybody kind of got the idea that that was properly done. But one thing I personally noticed there as well is that a transitional device would have definitely been good to put in right before the quote itself. So, saying comma, as they may feel like, and so on. So just little things like that, keeping in mind that, definitely connecting your own idea to someone else's, but also making sure that you integrate other people's work smoothly into your own.
Awesome, for sure. Cool, thanks, Mia. Okay, what I'm gonna do, I took a little bit of time to provide some of my own feedback on this. So I think all of those suggestions are totally valid. And I'm going to share a screen with you. I'm going to share some of my own feedback. So you can take a look at some of the things that I might recommend, but it's nice to look at this and note that people will notice different things. So one of the first things that I noticed as a body paragraph, I'm looking for the first sentence to be a topic sentence. And so I commented here, from this first sentence, what is the paragraph topic? When I read, when international students travel abroad, at first sight, everything seems perfect, but quickly reality catches up with them. So I have an idea that they're talking about some kind of struggle or difficulty, but I don't really know what they're talking about. And so getting directly to the actual topic, which here is how to address a language barrier when first traveling abroad, that might be a better topic. So I recommended, this was my own suggestion here, would be to take out this everything seems perfect, because that's a bit vague, and to combine it with the next sentence. So instead it would read, when international students travel abroad, the language barrier is the first challenge they face in a foreign country. So that's one possibility. I also noted throughout the paragraph, they use a lot of absolutes. The language barrier is certainly the first challenge they face. For sure, a language barrier for someone in a country with a different language from what they speak is definitely a barrier, but it's not certainly the first one. Maybe they had a really difficult plane flight. Maybe they had a hard time arriving. Maybe they were supposed to be picked up by somebody and they weren't picked up. And that's would be their first challenge, right? So using words like certainly is definitely not ideal. And I've noticed that in a few sections throughout this paper. I also just made a couple changes. Mia, she mentioned, you mentioned introducing quotes here. So you said in a foreign country, as they may feel like they have the skills. That's an awesome suggestion for sure. I put a suggestion here of introducing a quote with a colon. That's also an option to basically communicate that the writer is emphasizing this point by including this quote. So that's another way that could be done. Mia's suggestion might be better. Either are totally valid. Let me just check the chat here. I just saw something come in. Also a great suggestion. Thanks, Mia. I also included, Mia, you mentioned transitional devices, things here, trouble for simple things such as, including that transitional device, maybe reducing some wordiness. I made the comment here, I felt like this international students have to remember that to solve a problem, they can adapt a solution that works sustainably. One way to adapt quickly is changing how they are learning. I found this a little bit unclear of what they were actually trying to communicate, and I think this speaks to what Group 1 talked about, where they're sort of providing a solution before their problem is really clear. And I think this is a good example of that here. So I didn't really provide a solution here because I just commented, I provided a possible option. That's something that I often do in the comments, but I don't actually change their work. There's a bit more space for them to play with that as it is. I also, there was, up at the top, there were some actual run-on sentences. Here at the bottom, they do use connection words like and or as well as, but I felt like some of the sentences were very long. So here, at first, talking to Native people is always, again, that's quite an absolute term to use, a good way to understand a language, and also, and then they go on. But the first part of this sentence here, and the second part of the sentence are two completely different ideas. So when they're two different ideas, it's probably best served to have separate sentences and maybe transition words that help bring the reader from one idea to the other. I also commented down here, they just have to find a way to turn things that may be boring into things they like doing. Now it depends on your audience, it depends on your assignment that you're given, but this feels a little bit informal to me for an academic piece of writing. They just have to find a way to turn things that may be boring. That's not the most like formal or appropriate way to speak to things. So I just made a comment that says, is there a less casual way to phrase this? Maybe speak to their motivations. So you could kind of formalize this by saying, students will, or international students would most likely improve their motivation by being interested in or focusing on tasks that they are interested in for the sake of language learning. Something like that. That's kind of a rough thing that I just threw out there now, but that's also a good way to kind of identify formality within your writing. And then the last thing I noticed here is the citation formatting. So we talked about citations this morning with Adrian. Based on their citation up here with ISEP 2016, it looks like they're citing an APA format. If I was working with a student on this paragraph, I would probably double check with them on what citation style they were recommended for their paper. If it was indeed APA, then I would probably go to Purdue OWL or one of the other sources that Adrian provided this morning, maybe online, maybe one of the Writing Center style guides, and we would look up how to properly cite this website together. But this here is not correct. We don't have an author. If we go to this website, okay, if we go to this website, here I see this article and I have a contributor. This is written by Madison Byrne. So here I have an author. So that author definitely needs to be in my citation. So that's also something that I would look at. We did make sure that our citation styles are appropriate and that they're proper. Okay, so that was just an example, a lot of my feedback that I've written before and things to keep note of, but I think it's just a good way to start looking into what kind of feedback that we give and to make sure that we're being really specific.